The question is motion number 4, as on the order paper. I call the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This is a seminal debate in the history of this House and for the future of our country. I've been in the House since 1983, and this debate and this decision we'll take next week is one of the most important we will ever take whilst we're members of this House. The deal before us would make our country worse off. Taken together with the withdrawal agreement and the future partnership, they present a huge and damaging failure for Britain. The Prime Minister says this is a good deal and is so confident of that that she attempted to refuse to publish the government's legal advice. She was forced to publish it by votes in this House today. However, the economic assessments and other assessments which we will see indicate that this is actually a bad deal. These documents are the product of 2 years of botched negotiations in which the government spent more time arguing with itself than it did in negotiating with the European Union. It's not only on Brexit where they failed. The economy is weak. Investment is poor. Wage growth is weak. Our public services are in crisis, and local councils are collapsing because of this government's refusal to fund them properly. More people in this country are living in poverty, including 500,000 more children since 2010. The government should be ashamed of themselves for that. Poverty is rising, homelessness is rising, household debt is rising too. Mr Speaker, it's against this backdrop that this government has produced this botched deal that even breaches the Prime Minister's own red lines. Across this House, it's achieved something. It's united both Conservative Remainers and Conservative Leavers and members of every opposition party in an extraordinary coalition against the deal. Mr Speaker, Mr Speaker, Mr Speaker, it could have all been so different. It could have all been so different following the 2017 election. The Prime Minister...
Order, calm yourselves. Some of these antics are rather undesirable and to be deprecated. They may have a role on the playing fields at some public school, I don't know, but they have no role in this chamber. No, they're just unseemly and inappropriate. Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr Speaker, it could have all been so different following the 2017 general election.
I'm going to say it once, but I'll say it as many times as necessary, and colleagues who want to speak will be prevented from doing so by that sort of pathetic self-indulgence. The right honourable gentleman will give way when he wants to give way. If you don't like it, frankly, you can lump it. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It could have all been so different. Following the 2017 election, the Prime Minister could have attempted to build a consensus, recognising the new arithmetic of Parliament, and sought a deal that brought people together. Instead, just like her predecessor, who called a referendum without preparing for the eventuality of a Leave vote, the Prime Minister has seen these negotiations only as an exercise in the internal management of the Conservative Party, and that did not work out very well at all. When the two previous Brexit Secretaries, who theoretically at least led the negotiations, well, they did theoretically, say they cannot support the deal, how can she expect anyone else in this House or in this country to have faith in a deal that's been rejected by two of the people that were involved in the negotiation of it? Mr Speaker, no deal is not a real option. Mr Speaker, no deal is not a real option, and the government knows that, because it is not seriously prepared for it. 11 out of the 12 critical infrastructure projects, 12 critical infrastructure projects that would need to be in place by the end of March 2019 to manage a no-deal Brexit are at risk of not being completed on time, according to the National Audit Office.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for having the courage to give way to somebody on this side when he refused to give way to the former Shadow Chancellor 3 times running. Why could he explain to the House why he has not got the courage to debate my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, on Sunday?
I'm quite happy to debate the Prime Minister. I noticed she wasn't very keen to debate with anybody during the general election, but that's in the. But we understand that. Mr. Speaker, the government has been forced to publish its full legal advice, voted for by this House. I hope and assume that advice will be published tomorrow, because members ought to be in possession of all of the facts. In 2007, the Prime Minister then argued, and I absolutely agreed with her, that the full legal advice should have been made available before the Iraq War. I agreed with her then. Why did she push it right to the wire here and lose 2 votes in the House in order to try and prevent the legal advice being published that's so necessary to inform us in our debates? This withdrawal agreement is, Mr. Speaker, a leap in the dark. It takes us no closer to understanding what the future of our country post-Brexit would look like. And neither does the future partnership, which I will come on to. The Prime Minister states that the transition period ends in December 2020. Article 132 actually says it can be extended for up to 2 years to the 31st December 2022.
That Brexit is painted as dividing our nation, but it's actually united our party in opposition to her, in opposition to the Prime Minister's proposals. And it's united many people on that side, 2 former Brexit secretaries, the former Foreign Secretary, and 2 former Science and Higher Education ministers. I actually wanted to ask the Prime Minister who the new Science and Higher Education Minister is. She didn't take my intervention. Perhaps batting for that sector is incompatible with her Brexit and indeed any form of Brexit.
Just before we proceed, can I just very gently say to the House that intervention should be brief, not mini speeches. The Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my friend for the intervention. The Labour Party discussed the issue at great length at party conference, agreed we would oppose this deal, and said that if the government can't govern, and can't command a majority of the House, then the great British tradition is those governments resign and you have a general election.
I thank my right honourable. Why don't you just take him? I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Will my right honourable friend agree that this Santa Claus letter of a deal offers no protection for workers' rights, for jobs, for the environment, for frictionless trade? Vote it down.
Mr. Speaker, my friend is right, because what this deal doesn't do is ensure that if there are changes across the EU in improvement of workers' rights and conditions, they're necessarily mirrored in this country. And when the Prime Minister talks so grandly about workers' rights in this country, what comes to my mind is 1 million people on 0 hours contracts. What comes to my mind is people trying to make ends meet by doing 2 or 3 jobs just to feed their children. The Prime Minister states that the transition period ends, as I said, in 2020. Article 132 actually says this can be extended for up to 2 years to December 2022. The Business Secretary is already clear it's likely to be extended to that period, and under this bad deal we'd have to pay whatever the EU demands to extend it for those 2 years. Under this deal, under this deal in December 2020, we will be faced with a choice, Mr. Speaker. Either pay more and extend the transition period, or fall into the backstop. At that point, Britain would be over a barrel. We would have left the EU, have no UK rebate, and be forced to pay whatever was demanded. Alternatively, Article 185, the Northern Ireland Protocol, the backstop, would apply. Not only would that mean Northern Ireland would be subject to significantly different regulations than the rest of the UK, but the EU has a right of veto over the UK's exit from the backstop arrangement. Far from taking back control, this is actually handing control to somebody else, which is what the Prime Minister is asking us to support today. Whether in a backstop or an extended transition, the UK would have no say over the rules. We could, by that time, have already given up our seat on the Council of Ministers, our Commissioner and our MEPs, without having negotiated any alternative say in our future. This government is not taking back control, it is losing control. No wonder.
In terms of control, the one item that is in control of all of us is which way we vote on Tuesday. The Right Honourable Leader of the Opposition has said he does not want no deal. The EU leaders have made it clear it is this deal or no deal. Does he realise that it will be his vote that pushes us into no deal? Because that is what it is asking us to go for.
Mr Angus Brendan McNeill.
Speaker, I distinctly heard Donald Tusk at the weekend saying the options are no Brexit, no deal or this deal. So to say it's a binary choice is not right.
I'm extraordinarily grateful for the honourable gentleman's elucidation, but that intervention suffers from one notable disadvantage, and that is that it wasn't even tangential to being a point of order. The honourable gentleman's intervention and points of order are not even nodding acquaintances in my experience. Mr Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr Speaker, it really is not credible for the government to come to this House with this deal that does damage a great deal of our economic interests, that does reduce our powers to decide our relationships in the future, does damage our trade, and then say there's no alternative. This House will make its decision next Tuesday. I hope and expect this House will reject that deal. At that point, the government has lost the confidence of the House. I think they should reflect on that. Either they've got to get a better deal from the EU or give way to those who will. And no wonder the Science Minister, the member for East Surrey, resigned, saying this deal will cost us, and I quote, our voice, our vote and our veto.
The opposition.
Chris, come over here.
It is so emphatic that we won't have a no-deal exit if we reject the Prime Minister's deal. What deal does he suggest we're going to put in place between now and March of next year, which will avoid that?
Well, Mr Speaker, if the House rejects this deal, as I hope it will, it's then up to the government to go back and negotiate something like a new comprehensive customs union, which would be backed by both the TUC and the CBI, which is necessary to defend jobs and also have access to a strong single market. We cannot be told this is the only thing we can do. The process of negotiation is to be accountable. The government is going to be held to account. I hope this deal is rejected, in which case we will force the government to go back and negotiate. The last 2 years, Mr Speaker, the last 2 years... Oh, all right, yes, OK.
I want to hear the intervention. A lot of noise. Mr Christopher Leslie.
Very grateful. Actually, Mr Speaker, I wanted to agree with my honourable friend. that I agree this is a bad deal, doesn't he agree that our country would be better off remaining in the European Union than exiting on the basis of this deal?
Mr. Speaker, the referendum took place. We fought the election respecting the result of the referendum. We are opposed to this deal. We think there is the possibility of getting an agreement which would be better for this country and give us the control which is not given by this government's proposals to us. The last 2 years gives us no confidence that the government can do a deal in under 2 years, taking us up to the transition period. So at some point before December 2020, the focus would then inevitably shift from negotiations on the future relationship to negotiations on an extension of the transition period, including negotiating what further payments we would have to make to the EU. So, Mr. Speaker, we are over a barrel, either paying whatever is demanded or negotiating away fishing rights or who knows what else. This is a terrible failure of negotiation by this government. Should the backstop come into force?
I thank the right honourable friend for giving way. Would you agree that the Prime Minister will not take her political declarations for this deal to the people because she is afraid that her Brexit ship would sink?
Well, we will know the outcome of that next Tuesday when the vote takes place in this House, but any analysis of this deal would show it's unacceptable and should be defeated in this House. Should the backstop come into force, there is no time limit or end point. It locks Britain into a deal from which it cannot leave. Remember that, it cannot leave without the agreement of the EU.
I'm grateful to the Right Honourable giving way. I wonder if he could, following his answer to his Right Honourable friend, could he now clarify? He says that the Labour Party stood on a manifesto that accepted the result of the referendum, and he was clear on that. And yet since then we know the member for Hayes and Harlington has suggested that the Labour Party's position would now be to support a second referendum. Would he now clarify, for the sake of the House, is the Labour Party's position to support a second referendum, or is it that they accept the result of the first referendum and will not support a second referendum?
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the member for Chingford has read the Labour manifesto with great caution and detail. Oh, he did. We were quite clear that we respected the result of the referendum, and in our conference motion we discussed the whole issue at great length, and our party agreed at the largest Labour Party conference ever held in our party's history unanimously to back the composite motion that we put forward, which did oppose this process which the government is putting forward, and suggests that if the government can't govern, and it looks increasingly like it can't, then it should make way and have an election. That is our priority. Should the backstop come into force, there is no time limit or end point. It locks Britain into a deal from which it cannot leave, as I said. This is, I believe, the first time ever, as was said yesterday in questions to the Attorney-General, the first time ever in the history of this country that we've signed up to a treaty that we could not leave out of our own volition. That is quite a serious indictment of this government. And in the backstop, restrictions on state aid are hardwired with an arbitration mechanism. But no such guarantee exists for workers' rights. New state aid rules could be brought in whether they were in Britain's interest or not. The Attorney-General made that very, very clear yesterday.
Order, just order. Don't need to have a bickering between members of the same party as to whom the Leader of the Opposition is giving way to. I think it is the honourable gentleman from Anhelion and Yar who's been invited to intervene. But just before he does, order, I should just remind colleagues, that it is legitimate to use mobile devices without impairing decorum. But it has just been brought to my attention there is a very widespread use of them, and I would just gently remind colleagues that they most certainly should not be taking photographs in the chamber. Yeah, no, I know exactly what I'm doing and what I'm saying and upon what advice. It requires no comment or contradiction, simply a recognition of the validity of the point. Mr Angus Brendan McNeill.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the honourable gentleman for giving way as well. The honourable gentleman talks about respecting the referendum. Fair enough, that's his point of view. I've got a different respect in Scotland. But the question I want to ask him is, will he respect the mandate that the Scottish Government has and the Scottish Parliament's will to have a second independence referendum? How far does his respect go?
Well, it's not actually relevant to this debate today, Mr Speaker. We are talking about the deal that the government has brought back, and that's what the debate is about. In the backstop of the regulatory frameworks dealt with by non-regression clauses are non-enforceable by EU institutions or by arbitration arrangements, and will give the government the power to tear up workers' rights, damage environmental protections and consumer safeguards.
Will he give way on that point? Isn't one of the most extraordinary things about the debate so far that we've not had a single mention of the word immigration? And yet it was meant to be one of the most important aspects of the referendum. The government hasn't even published an immigration bill. We don't know what our immigration policy will be next year. And don't we really want to stand up for the rights of young British people to be able to study, work, live elsewhere in the European Union? Because it's British people who've used it more than any other country in Europe.
I'm coming to that in my speech, but I just say absolutely. Young people need that right to travel, need that right to be able to study, and I think the Erasmus scheme has actually worked very well, giving opportunities for a lot of people to study. And I'll come on to this again, but I just think we should reflect on the massive work done by European Union nationals who've come to make their homes in this country and helped us developed our health service and many other services. The backstop would apply separate regulatory rules to Northern Ireland. This is despite the fact that the Prime Minister said this is something, and I quote, no UK Prime Minister could ever agree to. Another of her red lines breached. In fact, the list of the EU measures that continue to apply to Northern Ireland runs to 75 pages of the agreement.
Would my right honourable friend agree with me that this is a bad deal? And one of the reasons for that is the Prime Minister has spent much of the 2.5 years discussing the deal with her colleagues on the Conservative Party rather than negotiating with the European Union.
My friend is so right. This has been a negotiation with the Cabinet, it's been a negotiation with Conservative MPs, it's been a negotiation within the Conservative Party. That's where all the concentration has been, and indeed one of the Brexit Secretaries hardly ever went to Brussels anyway, presumably being more interested in arguments within the Conservative Party. It's also clear that the Prime Minister's red line regarding the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice has been torn up. Under the Prime Minister's plan, by 2022, we will either be in a backstop or still in transition, where we will continue to contribute to the European Union budget and follow the rules overseen by the European Court of Justice. Indeed, Mr Speaker, the Foreign Secretary said on the 25th of November only that the deal largely ends the jurisdiction of the ECJ. It is crystal clear that the Prime Minister's claim that this plan means we take control over our laws, money and borders is utterly far-fetched. On the future partnership, Mr Speaker, let's be clear. There isn't a deal. There's a framework for a future partnership. Our trading relationship with Europe is still to be negotiated, and it will take years to do that. We still don't know what our long-term relationship with Europe would look like, and that's why so many MPs across Parliament are not willing to vote for this blindfold Brexit and take a leap in the dark about Britain's future. There is no mention of the Prime Minister's favoured term, implementation period, anywhere in the 600 pages of the withdrawal agreement. And no wonder. There is precious little new to implement spelt out either in the agreement or in the future partnership. The agreement does call for a transition period, but there is nothing to transition to. It's a bridge to nowhere. As the 26-page document says, it can lead to a spectrum of different outcomes, as well as checks and controls. And we're expected to endorse that as a basis of our future relationship with the European Union. After 2 years of negotiations, all the government has really agreed to is a very vague wish list. And, Mr. Speaker, only three of its 26 pages deal with trade. It's not a trade deal. It's not even close to a trade deal. The trade deal recently signed between the EU and Canada took 7 years to negotiate and ran to 1,600 pages. In 2.5 years, this government has agreed to 3 pages of text on trade. It's hardly an encouraging start to future trade relationships. The former Brexit Secretary committed to, and I quote, detailed, precise and substantive document. We had the right to expect one. What we got contains no mention of frictionless trade, promised at Chequers, or even trade as frictionless as possible, promised before that. There is no ambition to negotiate a new comprehensive customs union with a British say that would protect jobs, trade and industry, and so uncertainty continues for business.
Does my right honourable friend agree with me? Does my right honourable friend agree with me that this deal does not deliver frictionless trade, and that this would have a negative impact on the economy and risk jobs as well?
It certainly doesn't deliver frictionless trade, and those working in industry are extremely worried about what's going to be happening in the future because they don't see this deal as protecting their jobs or their future. The demand for a new comprehensive customs union is one that has united both the CBI and the TUC because it protects manufacturing supply chains. The decision to rule out a customs union and the lack of clarity in the deal risks business investment being deferred on an even greater scale than it is at the moment, costing jobs and living standards. And many companies may decide the lack of certainty means they will explore their contingency plans to relocate elsewhere. Both the First Ministers of Wales and of Scotland have also made clear to the Prime Minister that they would support participation in a customs union to protect the economy and jobs. A commitment to a new and comprehensive customs union could, I believe, have found support in this House. The government didn't seek it.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for giving way. The Leader of the Opposition talks about uncertainty, but I put to him just one example as to why I would encourage him to support the Prime Minister's deal, and it's this. If that deal does not go through, we could face a situation at 11:01 p.m. on the 29th of March where 1 million UK citizens living in the EU27 will no longer have their rights guaranteed. What would he do in that position?
I would imagine the honourable member supports the Prime Minister's deal because he is incredibly loyal to his party, with a blindness about the dangers of this deal to the rest of the country and the jobs that go with it. The lack of clarity around these proposals also means there is no guarantee of a strong deal with the single market to ensure continued access to European markets and services, merely a vague commitment to go beyond the baseline of the World Trade Organization. As both the Attorney General and the Environment Secretary have made clear in recent days, the commitments to workers' rights, environmental protections and consumer safeguards are very, very far from secure. Mr. Speaker, the social Europe that many people supported and continue to support was not part of why people voted to leave. All of that is at risk from this deal. This deal fails to give so many economic sectors and public services clarity about our future relationships with several European Union agencies and programmes. Take, for example, the Galileo programme. Caroline.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. On the environment, would he agree with me that the Prime Minister's deal seriously undermines environmental protection in this country because it does not replace the European Court of Justice with anything like the strength of an enforcement body? Instead of the promised watchdog, we've got much less than just a lapdog.
The member is absolutely correct, because the environmental protections that we have are obviously essential. You cannot protect the environment inside national borders. It has to be done across national borders, and we have to have the toughest possible environmental protection regulations. The suspicion that many of us have is that there's an appetite on that side of the House to remove many of these protections as time goes on.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. On the point of environmental protections and other protections, which is so important, does he agree with me that the government's obsession on clamping down on foreign aid, state aid, is something that is the wrong focus, and they should be focusing on all of the protections that we're bringing up right at this moment in time?
Mr. Speaker, the state aid rules of the European Union are something this government has been very, very happy to sign up to, and indeed used that as a means of not defending the steelworks at Redcar when they could have done something about it and defended those jobs in Redcar at that time. It's the failure of this government to do anything to protect those steelworks and those jobs that they should be condemned for. And I thank my friend for his intervention and the work that he did to try and protect those jobs. Take, for example, Mr. Speaker, the Galileo programme, to which the UK has so far contributed £1.2 billion. But now we seem set to walk away from it. Then there is a lack of clarity about whether we will continue to participate in the European Arrest Warrant, Europol or Eurojust. The Chequers proposal argued for the UK maintaining membership of the European Aviation Safety Agency and the European Medicines Agency, but the future partnership merely allows for cooperation.
I thank the right honourable member for giving way. Thank you, Chair. Does my right honourable friend agree that while the Prime Minister seems proud to claim freedom of movement has ended, she can't tell us what it will be replaced with? Is it not right that we see the government's immigration white paper before the meaningful vote?
I'm coming on to that in just 1 second. We lack similar clarity about many others, including Horizon 2020, Erasmus, mentioned by my friend, which have been so brilliant in providing students with opportunities to study in other countries. That is why so many young people are so concerned at this present time about what is happening. And, Mr. Speaker, there is no clarity about any future immigration system between the UK and the European Union. And it now seems the immigration white paper we were promised in December 2017 won't even appear in December 2018. Following the disgraceful Windrush scandal, many prospective migrants will have no confidence in the ability of this government to deliver a fair and efficient system.
Thank you. Thank you, my right honourable friend, for giving way. And thank you for mentioning immigration. Immigration is a serious thing that our young people are concerned about, and especially to do with Brexit. But because you've mentioned the Windrush scandal, do you agree that lessons learned is not good enough? We need a public inquiry to really understand the Windrush scandal and the hostile environment. And when we get this, we will understand more about how the government is committed to immigration and getting things right, especially at times like this.
this.
I thank my friend for her intervention, and as the daughter of a Windrush generation migrant to this country, she fully understands how horrible it felt in her community when this Prime Minister, as Home Secretary, deliberately created the hostile environment which was so damaging to community relations all across our country. And many EU nationals already here have no faith in this government to manage the process of settled status fairly or efficiently. These are people who've contributed to our country, to our economy, to our public services and especially our NHS. We all meet them in hospitals and doctor's surgery. It's these people who are now so anxious about their future. Mr. Speaker, to our negotiating partners in the European Union, I say this. We understand why, after 2 years of negotiations, you want this resolved. But this Parliament represents the people of this country, and the deal negotiated by this government is not good enough for the people of this country. So if Parliament votes down the deal, then reopening negotiations cannot and should not be ruled out. There is a deal that I believe can win the support of this House and bring the country together, based on a new, comprehensive and permanent customs union with a UK say, and real protection of workers' rights and environmental and consumer safeguards. Mr. Speaker, as I conclude, I've been very generous, Mr. Speaker, in giving way, particularly to that side. As I conclude, Mr. Speaker, as I conclude, I want to pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, a shadow Brexit Secretary and his team of shadow ministers. He's now facing his third Brexit Secretary. He's stayed the course, holding this government to account. And I thank him and his wonderful team and their supporters for what they've done and the success today in forcing the government to release the legal advice they were trying to withhold from us. This is not the deal the country was promised, and Parliament cannot, and I believe will not, accept it. The false choice between this bad deal and no deal will also be rejected. People around the country...
The Leader of the Opposition is not currently giving way. He's developing his point. He's developing his point. Members don't need to set themselves up as though they're conducting an orchestra. It is not necessary. Mr Hoare, for example, you're an incorrigible individual. Your assistance in this matter is not required. I'm afraid you're a veteran of Oxford Union badinage, and you've never really overcome it, I think. Jeremy Corbyn.
As I said, Mr. Speaker, this is not the deal the country was promised, and Parliament cannot, and I believe will not, accept it. The false choice between this bad deal and no deal will also be rejected. People around this country are very anxious. Businesses and workers are anxious about the industries they work in, the jobs they hold, and about the stability of this country. I've given way a great many times, and I'm going to draw my remarks to a close very soon. The responsibility, Mr. Speaker, for this state of anxiety lies solely with this government. 2 years of botched negotiations have led us here today. Members of this House have a very important decision 1 week today. To vote for this deal would be to damage our economy, to make our constituents poorer, and to take a leap in the dark for the future of this country. Don't take my word for it. The government published its own economic assessment, which found the Chequers proposals would make our economy nearly 4% smaller than it would otherwise be, thus knocking 100 billion out of our economy within 15 years. For those who like to break down these sorts of figures into weekly amounts, that's nearly 2 billion a week less. And that definitely was not seen on the side of a bus. Mr. Speaker, Labour will vote against this deal. A bad deal for Britain, a bad deal for our economy, and, I believe, a bad deal for our democracy. Our country deserves better than this.
Mr. Boris Johnson.